Okay, there we go. Okay, so hello everybody and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We have some fantastic guests that Peter is going to introduce to you, but first let me introduce Peter Ely, who will be our MC for the evening. He's going to introduce everybody and he'll be asking the questions. Peter is working with Sarah Upstone and Kate Scott and I on the Academic Excellence Project. And he is our researcher for the project, so he's heading up the questions this evening. So Peter is a writer and lecturer based in London. He's currently a postdoctoral research assistant at Kingston, as well as teaching on a number of London universities and institutions. His research work is at the intersection of philosophy, critical theory, and literature to examine the political potential of community in contemporary British society. He's the author of numerous journal articles and book chapters and is co-editor of Community in Contemporary British Fiction, which is forthcoming with Bloomsbury next year with Sarah Upstone. So thank you very much, Peter, and I hand over to you.
Thank you, Meg. Yeah, so I've just got a few bios for our great guests this evening. I'll start with Dr. Brian Bravatti, who, following a 20-year academic career at the Institute of Contemporary British History and Kingston University, has published 14 journal articles and books. He left to run human rights organisations and work as a mentor to private sector and social enterprises, civic leaders and politicians around the world. He has designed and written multi-year, multi-country programmes for the FCO and Cabinet Office across the MENA and former Soviet regions, and devised ethics, sustainability and governance programmes for multinational companies. Since leaving academia, he has written well over 250 funding bids, a dozen business plans, and run 10 fundraising programmes. His success rate over the last decade has gone from 0 to approximately 1 in 5. He now deals much better with rejection. So that's Brian. Then we've also got Aisha, who's independent consultant on advocacy and public affairs, currently working on projects with the United Nations. So Aisha Gilani, having been called to the UK bar, focused on family law and children's rights. She went on to complete a master's in international law with a focus on human rights, and subsequently pursued her career in international relations and human rights with the United Nations, the UK government and non-governmental organisations. She has extensive experience spanning several years in strategic communications, campaigns, marketing, public affairs and public policy. Her previous positions include Head of Communications with the UK's permanent mission to the UN in Geneva, the British Council, Switzerland, the Commonwealth, and more recently in the private sector with the International Federation of Consulting Engineers. And finally, we have John Tomlinson. John has worked in learning and development for most of his career, initially teaching English in Spain and then as a trainer, technical author and writer of learn materials for Virgin Atlantic Airways. After some freelance training and writing work, he ended up at the British Vice Consul in Alicante and then in Madrid, before leaving to be Director of Training Communications for a small IT startup, a role that he focused heavily on content marketing and public speaking. Most recently, he returned to the UK Foreign Office as Head of Learning and Development in Europe and Central Asia. He also leads on learning evaluation and continues to write freelance, including learning materials, speeches, blogs, and he's based in Madrid. So hi, everyone. I don't know if you could just quickly just say hello to everyone. Great. All right, I'm just going to go straight into questions. We're going to spend until maybe 10 to on these. So first of all, I've given a kind of introduction to all these different interesting careers and professional writing, but I was just wondering if each of you could just briefly explain what you do at the moment and how you got started in the field, and maybe particularly just focus on how writing and effective communication skills help to shape your career choices. So maybe Aisha, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Hello, everyone. Yeah, nice to be here, and thank you for having me and for the introduction, Peter. So I'm currently an independent consultant on public affairs and advocacy, and I support through freelance. I provide freelance support to organisations for their campaigns and their public outreach work, just to help with their objectives and priorities. And more recently, for example, I've been working with the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals and looking at the importance of human rights to the Sustainable Development Goals and how they're very much interlinked and not mutually exclusive. And so there's at times a tension between the two worlds. So I've been working on a couple of campaigns around that. But that's where I am now. But if I can just briefly explain how I got here. So as you mentioned, Peter, I started off studying law at university, and then I went on to pursue a master's in international law. Prior to that, I went on to train as a barrister, and then I developed a passion for human rights and studied masters international law and with a focus on human rights, child rights in particular. And through that, I developed a lot of analysis and analytical skills, research, etc. And I really wanted to move into the international sphere. So and I wanted to help save the world, as you do. So I thought, what better way than to go to Geneva, Switzerland, which is often described as the home of human rights. I did do a little bit of research prior to going out there, but essentially I gave myself a few months, and remember this is pre-COVID, quite some time ago. So I knocked on many doors, my CVs, sending CVs, setting up meetings with people, and just trying to get a foot into organisations. And I ended up working with Human Rights Watch. And that led to many other things, and other organisations were able to see my work, and I came across other opportunities. And one thing led to another, but as part of that, I really started developing an interest and experience in strategic communications, in outreach, in campaign work, and I really enjoyed it as well. And sort of some of the roles that I gained after that really reflect it, whether that's head of comms as at the FCO, at the UK Permanent Mission, or with the British Council. But writing is and was in particular an important part central to my work. And it is if you want to be an effective advocate as well. So it's a huge part of what I do. So that can be from whether I'm writing speeches for ministers, or whether it's policy briefs or social media strategy. Writing has really been part and parcel of my professional life. That said, there's also another element, of course, and that's storytelling and the narrative, and that's important in whatever I do. So whether that was in court, or whether, again, that's briefing journalists, it's telling stories, engaging your audience. So again, that's been a constant theme throughout my work. And also, I'd say that the work that I do, it's in the international sphere, a lot of it is project-based, subject to funding. So I don't have a linear career in that sense. I have a squiggly career, and I'm using that term because I read a book recently. It's called The Squiggly Career, and if anybody's interested, it's by two authors called Sarah Ellis and Helen Tupper, and it's about designing your career. And it's really to say, you know, sort of looking at reinventing yourself, etc. So that's exactly what I seem to be doing at the moment with my work. And also, as part of my work, I would say which has helped me in my writing, is this eclectic curiosity, as I describe it. It's really sort of having a passion for ideas, connections. I'm a dots connector. And so that's really helped in the projects that I do, and particularly in the writing that I do, and being able to navigate the different writing styles and the different organisations that I've worked for. So, you know, working for engineers and that audience is very different to the British Council audience, or, you know, working for a permanent mission and briefing on Syria, for example. But you know, foundation has been writing and communication, and that's right from academic through to all the jobs and gigs that I've had. So in a nutshell, that's what I do.
Great, thanks so much. That's such a great kind of explanation of how kind of creative professional writing skills can be so transferable to different places. John, I wonder if you could come in now on the same.
Yeah, sure.
Cheers.
Yeah, thanks. It's funny, Aisha, I'd also written down the word squiggly career from the same authors as well. And I was going to say the same thing, because I think whenever I sort of do my LinkedIn profile or write my CV out, it makes it look like there's been this arrow that's had this merciless journey towards where the job I'm applying for in my current role, which is of course absolute nonsense. It's been a zigzag career and quite squiggly, but the sort of themes that emerged throughout it, and they weren't that obvious to me at the start, was one, a kind of a real love of education. And initially, I think I was inspired by the idea of the fact that I personally enjoyed educating. I enjoyed the process, and a love of writing. And I think that was partly because, again, I enjoyed the process of doing it, and I felt I was reasonably good at it. And it was kind of the only creative thing that I really felt able to do. But I never really saw the two things as fitting together. I always thought that the writing was kind of a secret creative thing I did, but my proper job, my day job, was going to somehow be in education somewhere. So then when I went after my degree and I went abroad to Spain, essentially all I was trying to do was really prolong the student lifestyle for as long as I could to avoid getting a proper job. And incidentally, while I was there, I happened to obviously learn Spanish and make friends and get some experience teaching, which was great. But also it was a kind of a confidence journey, because I think everybody starts in a different place in terms of your self-confidence. And when it comes to kind of having a creative role, confidence, I think, sort of balancing self-awareness and self-confidence is really important. And at that point in my life, my self-confidence was close to zero, and my self-awareness was probably fairly close to zero as well. So I think the bits where I've succeeded in my career have been really where I have successfully managed to build those two things in tandem, my self-confidence with my self-awareness. So when I came out of teaching English, I sort of got tired of that and needed to give my liver a rest. I luckily really got that job with Virgin Atlantic that Peter mentioned, and that's where I really kind of realized that the role of education could really link with the role of writing, and suddenly people that work in learning and development, they tend to love facilitating training. They love being in the room working with people, and the kind of writing side of it was this kind of annoying thing that you had to do. But I increasingly realized that actually there was so much in that, and it was so interesting. And it was, you know, if you do creative writing, it's kind of about you telling a story. It's all about you. But with the writing that we do in education, it's not that at all. It's all about the reader. It's about how can you influence that reader? How can you increase their knowledge or increase their understanding, or even increase their sort of motivation and confidence themselves, so that they can go away and become a better, whatever it is you're teaching, a better leader, a better manager. How can you do that in words that aren't boring? They're engaging, and they keep people stuck to that topic, but in a way that's inclusive, that's not idiosyncratic. So you're trying to sort of be engaging and inclusive at the same time, which is really quite a hard thing to do. And I kind of that concept to me blossomed while I was at Virgin, doing initially as a trainer and then as a training manager, and I really enjoyed that process of trying to make that writing so sharp, all about the learner, but still keep it engaging. When I left there, I actually worked freelance for a little bit, which was a big mistake. And it just didn't work because I was trying to relocate to Spain. And I ended up as a vice consul, as Peter mentioned, which has absolutely nothing to do with writing and doesn't make any sense whatsoever in terms of my career journey. I just needed to pay the bills, and I was very fortunate to get the opportunity. But it was a brilliant gig, and while I was there, it was just the sort of social media was kind of becoming a thing as well, and a thing for professional organizations to engage with, not just a thing for individuals. So I was really part of how the British government overseas, how embassies and stuff like that started to try and engage with our customers, with British people. via social media, via blogs, via other content. So I was kind of really lucky to be in the right place at the right time to really help drive that forward. And the Foreign Office is the kind of place where it's surprisingly open. So even me, just a little vice consul out there in Alicante, not particularly anywhere in the hierarchy, was able to sort of influence quite a lot the organization's approach to social media, at least within the consular sector. So yeah, so I after I left there and I worked in a couple other places, I ended up back in learning and development, and now I'm the head of the team that covers for the British government all learning and development in the Europe and Central Asian areas. Somewhere in the middle of that, I also got a master's degree, and I think as learning and development moves away from being a model based on teaching, based on university, based on classrooms, and being more about how can you help individuals blossom in their organization, how can you help them achieve their potential, how can you help them improve their performance. Learning and development's really moved away from that teaching model to being much more about organizational development and working with people on performance. And having that master's degree, I think, having that MBA was a really important part of how I was able to be part of the team that took our learning and development teachy type function and move it into this kind of much more of an organizational development kind of function. And writing has certainly played a big part of that, not only in terms of creating learning materials, and increasingly that's more important as things become self-service and less about being delivered. So you need to have better and better writing, more skillful writing, but also just in general, just in terms of being influential in an organization. You know, if you can't write, if you can't communicate, people's biases assume that you're not very clever and that you're not worth listening to. If your writing isn't very good, isn't very concise, isn't very clear, people don't listen to the message. People ignore the rest of it. And I think that's something that's really kind of become clear to me over the last few years as well. Just writing skills in many and varied small ways are just hugely important to being more influential in the organization. But anyway, I'll stop there, Peter. And
oh no, thank you. That was
people's
really
ears at rest.
And then finally, Brian, if you could answer the same questions, that'd be great.
No, that was really interesting, both those squiggly careers, but with that central vein of writing. I suppose I've had sort of 4 phases or 4 different careers up to now, and they've all had writing as central to them. But I still feel like I'm learning all the time about different genres of writing. So you never stop learning the different languages, the different forms of writing, functional writing for a purpose, persuasive writing to win an argument, internal communications writing within an organization to sell yourself, applying for a job writing to actually answer the remit of the advert, get that covering letter correct, get that CV presentation correct. It goes through every single part of how you present as a person trying to build a career, but it never stops doing that. So at each stage in my various careers, I've had to relearn how to write, learn different ways of writing. So I began as a historian writing biographies about dead white men doing political things that about 7 other dead white men cared about and about 6 other living people read about. But I loved it. I mean, I love the process of going into an archive, of writing a history book. And I did that for a long time. And writing got me my academic career. There's no doubt that if you're pursuing an academic career of any kind, you need a higher degree, postgraduate qualification, a PhD, and you need to be able to write clearly, get your arguments across, organize your material. There's no other option really in all of the humanities, all the social sciences, of doing a higher degree if you want to be an academic. But I found increasingly that dead white men weren't that interesting. And so I sort of reinvented myself as an academic, as a professor of human rights. And to do that, I had to learn how to write curriculum. So some of the things that John was talking about, in particular about how you organize a huge body of knowledge, human rights, into a BA and an MA, and particularly with a strain which was my particular interest, which was comparative genocide studies. And that curriculum writing was a second sort of discipline of writing to learn. And that propelled me after a few years out of academia or entirely and into practice to run a charity. And the third sector is driven, as Isha mentioned, by the bid writing, the fundraising, again, functional writing for a purpose. The best entry level, sorry, the most entry level jobs, not necessarily the best ones, in the third sector are fundraising and bid writing jobs. And they're gettable with people with degrees in English, in creative writing, and we hope in the future with degrees in professional writing. But you need to have the precision to get the message across. So you need all the communication skills that have been talked about, and you need to be able to do respond to a call for funding, but also, and even more difficult sometimes, is go into the Foreign Office and persuade them that they really should be funding something in an area like combating gender-based violence in northern Iraq, that they're not funding in the way that you feel they should be, and persuading them by what you write in the end that there is a case to be made for a project in that space. And then finally, stepping out of organizations altogether to run my own small social enterprise, which is a community interest company, and living off the bids that were successful. And that's where I learnt a very bitter lesson over time, which was to make many fewer but better funding applications and not apply for every single potential grant that was out there, to be selective about where you target and what you're targeting. And then translating that in parallel to working more and more with the private sector. And that's where stories come in. A lot of ESG work, ethics, sustainability and governance, what used to be called corporate social responsibility, is trying to teach corporations to tell their stories better if they have good stories to tell, to understand the importance of how they engage with the communities in which they are operating. And that can be a project which is entirely unrelated to their core activity if it allows their own team to understand the role of human rights in business, to understand the role of ethics in business. And sometimes it's about getting people within those companies to tell their stories. So now I'm doing parallel projects, a lot of work in Iraq, in the Middle East, around recovery using methodologies developed by Meg Jensen at Kingston and Siobhan Campbell at the Open University called expressive writing, which is using writing and storytelling to recover from trauma and violence, and working on projects around volunteering. So my latest piece of work that's been finished brought together a lot of these different strands in a way. It was with the United Nations Fund for Population, and it was Iraq's strategy to encourage young people to volunteer. So that had to have different elements, different pillars of the writing challenge. It had to be a policy document that persuaded key ministers and others that volunteering in the Iraqi reconstruction and reconciliation process was important. It had to have an advocacy dimension, which would get civil society organizations to talk to government and come together around volunteering. And it had to make some suggestions about how you get young people to continue to volunteer. There's been a huge amount of volunteering during COVID-19 in Iraq. How do you build on that and how do you continue that? So in that piece of work, it brought together all different elements of writing over the years, all the different genres that I'd learned over time, and applied them to a particular gig. And that, I don't know if that's a squiggle exactly, or we call it also don't we, in the jargon, a portfolio. But it's a portfolio of writing. And I think if you're studying English, if you're studying creative writing or publishing or law or human rights, it's very important to stop and think, well, what are the skills that I have? In the big box I have of skills, there is writing. And within writing, to begin to think about how you organize different aspects of those skills and present them to potential employers. And we might talk a little bit more about what those are later on, because we've touched on a lot of them, I think, in different moments in our careers that have been described so far. We've used different menus, different portfolios of writing. And it's not just one big thing lumped together. And one of the ways of getting your skills across is to break it apart and present it.
Thanks, Brian. That was great. Yeah. So I mean, I guess just stepping back from all three of those amazing kind of initial answers, we can see straight away that writing is something that goes across loads of different industries and kind of has allowed for these incredibly varied and interesting job paths. So that's really great to hear about. And I guess feeding into that, my next question is about future trends. It seems all of you have had to get used to a job market that's increasingly about adaptiveness and change. And of course, at the moment, we know very well that that's going to be very much something we have to think about. We've got Brexit, we've got COVID in terms of the shifting economy and job market. So I was just wondering if you could maybe kind of think about what you envisage in terms of future trends in your respective industries, and maybe what the role of something like professional writing might have in that as well. So maybe we could start with John.
Yeah, hi. I think there are probably three main things that I think are influencing the field at the moment. I mean, first of all, sort of learning and development isn't a recognised profession in the same way as if you want to be a teacher, you have to do this. You want to be a lawyer, you have to do that. It isn't a recognised profession. But increasingly, like all things, it is trying to professionalise itself. And whereas in the past you could just sort of stumble into it from more or less any squiggle that landed on the right square, that's less and less true as it becomes a much more recognised profession and a more competitive field. So I think that's the first point, is that it's not so easy just to stumble into it as it used to be. It is more important to obviously have a certain amount of experience, but there is an expectation that you are, one, an expert in learning how adults learn, and that may or may not be a degree in organisational learning, in psychology or something of that nature, but there is an expectation of that. And there's also an expectation of the other side of it, which is around just business awareness. Because as I said before, it's less and less about teaching and more and more about helping people perform better in work, helping people be more connected to their roles, be more motivated, etc. And a lot of that requires a much broader awareness and knowledge of organizations, of businesses, of the industry that you're in. So I think it's marrying those two things, this expertise in learning and organizational change with the expertise in just generally organizations. So I think that those are kind of two big things which are changing. The profession's getting more competitive and it's moving away from teaching into that kind of organizational development space. And I think the third thing is, of course, the methods by which we help people acquire knowledge and skills is changing, and it's less classroom based and it's more a million different things. And therefore the role isn't just turning up and trying to deliver some training course anymore or facilitating a discussion. It might be scripting a storyboard one day. It may be pulling together materials, as Brian was talking about, where you're pulling together a complex thing and trying to distill it into something fairly simple and working out how you can step people through quite a sort of a complicated learning journey. It could be scripting things, as I said. It could be creating videos, podcasts, whatever. So it's just become a lot more things than being able to turn up and entertain people for a day whilst they're at work and hope they go out knowing how to give some feedback or whatever. It's become a much sort of broader and richer and deeper field. And I think I can see that happening just more and more and more.
Great, thanks. Yeah, no, it's really interesting to think about the increasing role of professionalization and maybe also the role that degrees, postgraduate degrees have in that. Aisha, I wonder if you could answer the same question for your industry.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think some of the greatest and the sort of the pressing challenges that countries are facing really require international cooperation. So, you know, climate change, etc. And that means that the importance of good communications across, you know, nationalities and cultures is even more important, particularly in international relations. But I think it's really hard to give, you know, difficult to predict, particularly with COVID and what the situation will be going forward. But there are trends, as John mentioned. I mean, some of they are related to online, virtual, and international organisations have had to really adapt hard and fast to, in particular, in relation to advocacy. Much of the work is now online. In my work, particularly in Switzerland, in Geneva, a lot of it is centred around conferences, meetings, in-person advocacy and influencing and campaign work. And of course, that has come to somewhat of a standstill. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any opportunities to exploit and take advantage of. And certainly I would say virtual, online, remote working is here to stay, and probably a hybrid going forward of in-person advocacy and also virtual. But having said that, I mean, also what's really, I think, inspired me and also sort of I've seen is the participation across the globe as well, because previously, you know, there are people that don't have access, aren't able to come to Switzerland or, you know, to the UK and be part of these meetings and events, etc. And so the pandemic has really showed that we've had to diversify in that sense. So it really pleases me to see organisations, civil society taking part from, you know, across the globe. And not the usual suspects as well. So I think in terms of accessibility, I think is great for the virtual meetings that we're having, technical issues aside. And I think it's really important to take advantage of those opportunities. I mean, sort of a side note, I mean, it's I'm a huge fan of the Hay Literary Festival, but I've never been able to make it in person. And last year it was amazing to see that festival, great thinkers and writers and academics coming together. But what really struck me actually was the participation and the number of people actually that could be part of that that community. So I think for me that trend is going to be hopefully a more diverse participation and not your usual suspects as well, particularly in relation to some of the work I do around human rights and sustainable development goals. You have, I wouldn't say cliques, but certainly certain organisations and certain people that have far more access because they're bigger, you know, donors, etc. So I've been really pleased to see that. And I think also just for people starting out in this area as well, what I'm seeing is a lot more internships, volunteer positions, and also jobs for working for organisations across the globe. I mean, employers seem to be far more amenable to working remotely. Internships in particular, I mean, they're usually quite, and again, my reference point is the work that I've done, particularly in Switzerland, where it's access to people who can come to Geneva, afford the internships or the volunteer positions, etc. But with this online and remote working, actually, you're seeing a lot more different applicants as well applying, and they can do that from whether it's the UK, whether it's, you know, based in India or whatever, but I've seen it for myself as well, a lot more people being attracted to that way of working and getting those gigs as well. So I'd say that's probably one of the main things to come out. But as I said, going forward, I think it's going to be, you know, certainly for the multilateral work that I do, it's going to be a hybrid, a combination, finding the best of both worlds, where you've got in-person advocacy and remote as well.
Great, thank you. And it's encouraging to hear about, you know, adaptations to COVID actually bringing about new possibilities and opening up accessibility. So that's really great. And finally, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a pessimistic and an optimistic way of viewing this. So the pessimistic way is that the third sector is hollowing out in terms of permanent jobs, and the unsustainability of many charitable and giving models in the UK as giving has collapsed, or been concentrated rather in particular sectors and been taken away from lots of other sectors. As we move away from the GDP contribution to international development, as this government shrinks the amount of development spending, so the number of people employed in those kind of international organizations will decline. And as COVID flexible working impacts, they see that their head office costs and overheads can be massively reduced by not employing so many people directly. You hollow out the center. That's the pessimistic view. The optimistic view is, right, therefore, you have to invent yourself as a freelance, you have to embrace the gig economy, you have to be flexible, you have to do a startup where you bring together people with different communication skills, language skills, subject matter specialisms into a little group that sets up a social enterprise, a third sector, a charity, or the hybrid in the sector, which is called a community interest company, which is not quite a charity, it's a social enterprise which has to do good, but doesn't have the architecture of trustees and so on. And you try and enter that third sector market and compete for things. And I think you're competing at the bottom end of the gig economy with things like people by the hour, where you can get a translator in the Palestinian territories who can turn a document round in 4 hours into Arabic for you for $20, against somebody who's running a company in that space, renting central office space in London, who may well have picked up all the work in the past, but won't necessarily in the future. Now, that does create an opportunity for social entrepreneurs. So in my kind of sector, I think you're going to see many more of these flexible short-term alliances for specific bids, for specific pieces of work. And that will be very good for people who are living flexibly, living out of the city centre, living cheaply, can connect, but they've got to be able to present themselves. And that comes back again to writing and your social media presence and your LinkedIn presence, it all being of a piece. You're joining the right networks, getting onto the right job sites and opportunity sites, and getting used, as we said at the beginning, getting used to rejection. Because it won't be a limited number of job applications before you get an interview. It might be hundreds of attempts to break in to a particular organization to sell your services of writing or whatever your services are to that organization. But once you were in, there will be recurrent work. But it means you have to be flexible in terms of when you get paid, and that changes patterns of how people live. I think more people will live at home for longer with their parents while building up a portfolio of work and developing opportunities in the social enterprise sector and so on and so forth. That's in the third sector, in the charity NGO sector. In the private sector, particularly in ethics, sustainability and governance, in corporate social responsibility, I think a lot of companies are going to be trying to desperately reinvent themselves in the post-COVID world to look more human. They're going to build back better by using it as an opportunity to rebrand. I think the re-engagement with the climate change agenda means that many companies who weren't changing when the US had opted out of the Paris agreements and so on, are now back into the business of having to change and having at the very least, to present themselves as changing. And I think there's another set of opportunities there of teaching companies the importance of communicating honestly and straightforwardly about their ESG agenda. And there's that's partly a social enterprise opportunity, but it's also more people need to go into companies with that subject matter specialism. That means degrees in human rights, it means degrees in environmental science, it means degrees in climate change and in communications and in professional and bid writing. So there's an optimistic and a pessimistic future the way I see it. Where there is absolute optimism for me is overall in the startup space. In the UK in particular, post-Brexit, as we shrink our economic opportunities and narrow our horizons, our only possibility of economic growth is self-invention, is startups, particularly tech startups. But for all of those, you need people who can write coherent and clear business plans. So again, for English graduates, graduates of any of the kinds of programs we're talking about, there's a huge opportunity if you can connect with the entrepreneurs in tech and other areas who, in my experience, often can't string a sentence together, but they're very, very good at putting code together. So there are opportunities, but there are also going to be, in this huge realignment we're living through, some great penalties.
Great, thanks, Brian. Offering a positive, also maybe more realistic appraisal of the present. Okay, so I know a lot of people who've come today are probably undergraduates that may be about to go into the job market. And I think you've already done a great job kind of explaining what that market's going to look like, what the changes are going to be, and therefore what the kind of adaptations or the focuses are going to have to be for graduates. But I was I was just wondering if we could focus on that a little bit more. So perhaps some of you have been involved in hiring. Certainly you've been involved in applying for all the different jobs that you've had. So I was just wondering kind of what skills your industry looks for in applicants, whether there's something to say about postgraduate degrees, and if you could just offer kind of general advice for graduates who are starting out in a career in professional writing. Obviously, all of you have had different kinds of writing careers, so do you have advice for students wishing to do the same thing? Maybe we could start with you, Aisha.
Yeah, I mean, some of the issues, some of the things Brian touched on and earlier, sort of about the postgraduate degrees and the necessity, particularly in international work and international relations, the prerequisite is often a master's degree, particularly for entry-level positions. And sometimes experience is taken in lieu of that, but certainly postgrad degrees are, whether it's in journalism, creative writing or human rights, are favoured. But I think also in terms of more generally, I would say that postgraduate, I did a master's, and I think it gave me additional tools and a foundation in writing, analysis, structuring coherent arguments, etc. And that's the stuff that you can carry throughout your professional life. And I also think in terms of, particularly through postgraduate degrees, I'm a huge advocate because I think it allows you to build a network, mentors, access to a community, as it were, which you take throughout and you build on that as you advance in your career. I would also say in terms of being imaginative as well, making sure that you update your writing skills, be creative in how you showcase them. And that can be, sort of through your blog spaces, whether that's through writing reviews, even on books. For example, I used to work with a colleague of mine who was a great fan of this writer on business and human rights, and had written a book, this academic, and I suggested that he write a review about it, and he posted it up on a blog site. He also did that for Amazon, and subsequently it got to the author, and I think about a year down the line they co-authored an article together. And I'm not saying that works every time, but it's also about creative engagement as well, and how you use those skills as a graduate or as a postgraduate, trying to build that network as you go forward, because I think that's it's a buzzword, but it is hugely important, particularly now when we're not readily when we don't have access to those networks in person. I mean, I was quite fortunate. Much of my sort of breaking into the human rights industry or area was through networking. And then, of course, we're now a bit limited to that. But I think so taking advantage of any opportunities that we can have. And in terms of social media, I think that LinkedIn is all very good, but it's meaningful engagement as well. And it's not trying to connect just with somebody, but also sharing their articles or commenting on those articles is equally a way to, showcase what you think about them, and also that you're able to, sort of synthesize what they've said, etc. So again, it's just trying to be a little bit more imaginative on that. I'd also say, starting out, don't be too picky on the work that you get. Take the gigs, volunteer. If you've got access to national chapters, for example, or national arms of organizations, whether that's Amnesty International. It's quite romantic to think about New York and Switzerland and myself included, but quite often sort of the local work that you do, you get a foot in the door, you get access to a network, you're part of the family, as it were. And the reality is that you are looked a little bit more sort of favorably if you've had access to that. So I would say things like that is also important, to see what you can do at a local level before sort of leapfrogging and saying, I want to work in New York and for the UN. I think it's to, sort of take bite-sized approach to that. What else? I think personally for me, what I'm looking for is also, when I'm hiring people, whether it's junior assistants or it's been interns, one thing that's really struck with me is sometimes you don't really need an expert in that field necessarily as communicators. What you want is somebody who has the ability to communicate that message. There are technical experts already, and you can defer to them. So, for example, one hire I had, it was a young a student who had no experience in international relations or human rights, but she was amazing in photography and social media. And I remember her at the UK mission when I hired her, and there was a little bit of a pushback, because she didn't have that experience. But we were trying to up our game in digital communications, and I knew that through the images she was using and looking at her social media presence, that she was the person. And really, I just tried to explain to people that what we don't want is a replica of us. We don't need another expert. And quite often you need a dispassionate sort of voice as communicators to be able to, tell stories or set a narrative. So for me personally, I also like to go off the beaten track as well and look a little bit outside the usual suspects, as it were. So that's what I look for.
Great, thanks. And a really interesting reflection on networks and the kind of digital age and how important they're becoming. Brian, I wonder if you could go next.
Yeah, I mean, I think somebody's asked in the chat, is it a complete reinvention of what it means to be a writer? No, but I think what we're all saying in different ways, it's a change in the way you present the knowledge that you have. And therefore, yes, it's very important to do postgraduate work, and being a subject matter expert is very important in certain areas, but also that you present yourself on social media in every possible conceivable opportunity that you have to write and publish online, because you can self-publish constantly, and you can draw attention to that self-publishing. And in capacity building, just to echo what Isha was saying, cross-cultural awareness and languages will be even more important in the future, as we in the UK try and build this new international economy. But because the world has learned that you can run international programs online, but you need translation, you need cross-cultural awareness of how to run those kind of programs. It's incredibly difficult to run training programs anywhere, but running them online in a third language needs a lot of new skills to be developed. But fundamentally, the job market requires English graduates, publishing graduates, to understand the skills that they have in the way they present themselves to an employer. And that employer is not necessarily going to be interested in the traditional presentation, but they are going to be interested in the fact that you reviewed a book at length on Amazon or on your own blog. They are going to be interested in a career objective that's thought through. And my favorite illustration of this, and forgive me, Gary and Elio, one of my old students, is on this program and he's heard this story before, but it's the Michael Jackson story. So Michael Jackson, not the singer, the former controller of Channel 4, from a very early age wanted to be the controller of a network television station. So he read media at university and he wrote his dissertation on the career paths of network television directors. And he analysed what they did, how they did it, and how they got that job. And at 27, he became the director of, I think, CBS News. And at 35, some ridiculously young age, he became director of Channel 4. Thinking about the objective of where you want to be in terms of your career in 5 years' time, think about each of the steps to that. Everything you write and publish online can serve you in getting you towards that destination. Even what you do as your dissertation or what you do as your master's dissertation can help you along that road towards that eventual objectives, because you may not get there in one step. In the gig economy, you take every opportunity that you can, as Isha said. You seize every opportunity to volunteer. You seize every opportunity to publish and get your work out there, your name out there. You build your CV and your digital imprint that way. And then slowly you develop closer towards your objective, whatever that larger objective goal is. There are still jobs that will be advertised that you will apply for. But even for those jobs, you need to present your knowledge, your skills, and your degree in different ways than you have done traditionally. And, you know, the fact is that most CVs are initially read by machines when you apply for a job. So there are free services online that will rewrite your CV so that a machine will read it correctly. Well, use those skills that are out there to help yourself in the way you are presented, and use the knowledge embedded in your degree, not the title of the degree, in the way you describe it. English teaches you to concentrate a huge amount of information into a succinct and well-argued piece of work. Well, show that in the way you present yourself and in your covering letter. So there are still traditional opportunities, but I think they've shrunk. And I think in the much larger realm of untraditional opportunities, you need to completely reinvent the way you present yourself and you compete in that space.
Thanks, Brian. And can I just, before I ask John to answer as well, can I just ask if anyone has any questions, if you can start to put them into the chat, that would be really great. We'll get to them after. But finally, John, if you could answer that question as well, that would be great. Thanks.
Well, I don't really have a great deal more to add than the brilliant advice that Aisha and Brian have already said, to be honest. So rather than repeat all of that, I think I would just, echo some of that. Absolutely. Brian was given the example there of Michael Jackson, not the singer, and how he wanted to be the director of Channel 4 or of a TV network. I mean, most of us don't have anything quite that clear in our minds at any point in our lives, let alone from being a child. But I think that one of the principles around communications is you start by thinking, what input do I want to have on the receiver of the communication? Do I want to inspire them? Do I want to excite them? Do I want to inform them? And that's where you start. So what's the impact I want to have? So then you take the step backwards and you say, well, therefore, how can I have that impact? Therefore, what input do I need to make in order to eventually? And you can sort of take that same principle as Brian was saying there about if you want to be the head of a TV network, well, what would the person who's about to get that job be doing? So what's the step just before that? And then what's the step just before that? So you can sort of think backwards through those steps. And I think that's quite a useful way of thinking through how to get to, if you want to be a writer, a professional writer, whatever that might be, think backwards. What would they be doing just before they became a professional writer? What would they be doing just before that? It's a very useful kind of thinking approach to doing that. I don't really have much more to add, but the only thing I would just sort of say is practice. I mean, writing is like any other craft. It takes an enormous amount of practice. Writing in the fields where I work in education, it doesn't really matter what you think of your writing. It matters what the receiver thinks of your writing. It matters whether or not they feel informed, educated. Have they understood something? Have they learned something? That's the only thing that really matters. So I would say practice. Get really good at succinct, clear, absolute bang-on writing that gets the point across, and ask for what other people think of it. You know, ask around: is this good? Is this communicating? Are the words I could scrub out here? Is some of any of this superfluous? And yeah, and not much else to add. So I'll happy to go to questions.
Peter, can I just jump in very quickly? I think something that was just said by John is really, really important. So putting creative writing to one side for a moment, thinking about what the receiver wants from that writing is absolutely critical. And actually reading the brief and writing to what the brief asked, rather than what you think the brief should have asked or what you actually know about, is hugely important in everyday working life, but even more so in job applications. So there's no good doing one blanket statement and one blanket covering letter. You'll never, in the old-fashioned jobs that are still available, each application has to be crafted, and you have to use the language that they use. You have to use that, exactly what John said. What does the receiver want? What is the receiver thinking of your writing? You may write the most wonderful Thomas Mann-ish sentences that go on for 3 pages, but if that's not what is needed for the gig, then forget it and write exactly what the receiver wants.
And if I can just as well just add to that, because I think so, in the job application process, usually there are loads and loads of job applications. You know, the last job I advertised for, I think we had 801 applicants. Fortunately, a machine got rid of 750 of those, so I only had to look through 51 of those. And I know some of those machines got rid of some pretty good applications because I knew some of the people who'd applied. Of those 51 applications, I read probably one of them before I got bored. And then I laboured through 49 others. So being able to write really succinct job applications, that bear in mind the fact the reader doesn't want to read reams and reams of stuff because it's boring and it's overwhelming. So getting really good at kind of sharp answers focused on what's being asked. And similarly in interviews, if you kind of picked any sort of random 100 people, you can pretty much guarantee that put them in a job interview, 98 of them are going to bore the pants off you, and they're just not going to sound particularly convincing. Being able to do a really good, sharp interview, which is not easy if you've just come out of university and you don't have bags of experience to talk about, but being able to do a really good interview is the difference between succeeding and failing. It really is. And it is, obviously you need to do the really good application to get the interview, but once you've got an interview, really spend some time, practice, get sharp, talk to people who know how to do interviews, because it's one of the most important skills you can ever learn.
Oh, thanks, John. I don't think we've got any questions in the chat, so I think if I can just ask people, if you can think of any questions, please do put them in. And maybe I can just go first, because I did have one more question for you all, which was just about the kind of diversity and inclusion agendas, which sort of becoming more important. And I was just wondering about what you thought the impact of those was in your field, and if you were aware of any schemes or any kind of projects in relation to them at the moment. Maybe we can start with Brian.
So there's a paradox in a way. So when we're talking about the new economy that we're seeing, in a way, that's a big opportunity for inclusion, because if you are working remotely, if you are in the gig economy, you can present yourself in ways that don't necessarily reveal your identity, and you may get closer to some gigs because people can't see who you are and be prejudiced against you. But then again, those groups who are excluded may not be as good at doing the networking and the presenting that would get them those opportunities. So I think there's a big challenge here. The third sector is pretty good in terms of inclusion and representation. Around 60% of CEOs of charities are women, for example. Around 35% of people working in the third sector are from British Asian backgrounds. Not so good on neurodiversity, and there's a prejudice in a lot of the literature against age. So a lot of older people like me, who looking for sort of last careers, think the third sector, the charity sector, you know, I can go and work, I can use all my skills that I've built up over a lifetime, and they're discriminated against in terms of getting jobs in favor of younger people who organizations want to train up quite naturally. But overall, the charity sector is quite inclusive. There are constantly in the large charities, and it's worth really analysing them, looking for their initiatives. Many of them will advertise specifically. So, for example, a friend runs Conciliation Resources, which is a conflict transformation organisation. He was advertising for trustees, and he went out of his way to specifically exclude people like me, who would love to be one of his trustees, from bothering to apply, which was quite right. You know, he didn't need another old, white, soon to be dead former human rights professor on that board. He needed somebody who represented a different part of the community. So it's really, and that drills down into job applications in the charity sector, much more so than in the private sector, where they will specify this is an inclusive opening that we are actively looking for. In terms of initiatives, there are specific initiatives, and it's worth looking at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, for example, for programs. They run programs in neurodiversity and BAM, encouraging into specific professions. There are large numbers of programs for women returners, trying to get those people back into employment after a career break with children, and those are particularly private sector. And there is a disproportionate hire across the whole of the private sector in ESG, in ethics, sustainability and governance, and corporate social responsibility. They are the most inclusive sections of the private sector. They deal with inclusion and equality, go figure. But they're nevertheless, those places do hire disproportionately, although not at senior level. And there are still glass ceilings, even in those parts of private sector companies which deal with inclusion and equality, ESG and so on. There are still fewer senior minorities, women and neurodiverse people in senior positions in those companies than in other bits, than in proportion to the population. But overall, the charity sector does have initiatives in this space, and it's worth looking carefully because you can identify them if you belong to one of those excluded groups.
Thanks, Brian. I wonder if we could go to Aisha now.
Yeah, no, thanks, Peter. We could, I think we could devote an entire session just to this, to be honest. But, you know, sort of briefly sort of my thoughts and also a little bit sort of my own experience, if you like. But I think it's diversity, inclusion, representation, hugely important. We know that, studies show that. It's, you know, not just a moral case and ethical, it's also about the economics as well. It makes business sense for organizations to really, you know, diversify who they hire and have a more inclusive approach to their hiring. I think just to put it, you know, slightly sort of dampening on things, this week we had International Women's Day, but, you know, we learned that the impact of COVID has, you know, sort of, it's a huge rollback on gender equality and women's rights. So I think in that sense, it's a little bit disappointing. And so we've got still headway, but of course, diversity and representation is gender, disability, you know, race, religion, but also I think it includes educational background, social class, life experiences as well. So I think we have to really be attentive to that as well in terms of hiring. It's great to see that there are a lot of initiatives that are happening, and sectors are waking up to the fact that you need this more diversity. But I would say, and that diversity in terms of in print and on screen. But I think what's also really important is to have those behind the scenes. So those writers, those storytellers, those script writing producers, etc. And I think if you want lasting change, it's got to be behind the scenes as well as in front of. And that includes, of course, on boards, being on representation on boards, and really also when you have those different voices, it's making sure that they are there for who they are and not what we want them to be as well at times, because I think organisations, because then it becomes a tick the box exercise. So I think we also have to be quite cautious in that and how that's perceived. International relations and the work that I do, I would say it's slow, the progress that's being made in terms of diversity. There are people from diverse backgrounds, but at a more junior level. I'd say at the senior level, it's still lacking. And even within that diversity, it depends of who you know and the access. Right to even internships, for example, as well, because you might not be able to afford an internship in headquarters, for example, or in one of the big organizations, if you don't hear about it, if you don't know somebody, or if you can't afford to have unpaid work. But I think that, there are some good initiatives, and slowly, there is progress being made. But you have in the private sector, or certainly companies like Sky News, for example. Actually, I came across recently their initiative and sort of the targets that they've set for 2025 to really change their approach to recruitment. And that's both on screen and off screen and senior leadership as well. And I think things like that are really good for institutions and universities, for example, to try and work with those companies and put them in touch or connect them to students that might be interested in that area of work. So I think it's incumbent upon, sort of institutions, but it's a two-way conversation as well. It's those hiring and those that are looking to be hired. But I think one other thing I'd say that it's quite important to not group sort of, whether it's we're talking about the Black, Asian, ethnic minority community, for example, as one homogenous sort of group, because there are different factors within those groups as well as to why they might not be attracted to creative writing or a career in international law and human rights. So there's things that you have to look and have perhaps a more nuanced approach when it comes to it, because it's quite often I see initiatives that are more like a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think if you want long-term sustained and sort of retain a diverse set of people, it's good to look and be more targeted in that sense. I think for me personally, role models are very important as well. It's important to see the people on and off screen to reflect those around you. When I was starting out, I didn't have that. I had my parents and sort of, my father, a lawyer, mother's a teacher, and my grandfather was a radio broadcaster and a journalist, sort of post-partition India. And so it was good to see that, and I had determination. But I have to say, on a personal level, the doors didn't open so easily, and still don't, to be honest. You have to work twice as hard as some of my peers professionally. But I'm quite Pollyanna and optimistic about it. So change is happening. Difficult conversations are taking place. We've seen that just this week, and I think that's important. But I'm a fundamental believer in you've got to have more of a nuanced approach to how we hire as well, and have these schemes if we really want to attract the diverse set of voices and to reflect society as it is today. So.
Thanks,
I could go on, to be honest. As I said, we need one whole, session on this, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, there was some really excellent reflections. Thank you. And yeah, I've heard a lot recently about this term BAME being quite erasing in the way it lumps people together. So yeah, focusing on specific communities and how things affect them, I think is really important. Finally, John, if you could.
Yeah, yeah. The point about the word BAME is interesting, isn't it? Because that is something that is specifically sort of used as a category for inclusion and thinking around diversity type issues, and I've always been very uncomfortable with it, and as a kind of a white person, because it kind of implies that everyone else has a race and I don't, which is I think a lot of the way that kind of default white thinking, which I think is half the problem. But anyway, the organisation I work for is the Foreign Office, although we're not called that anymore. We're called the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. But there actually is quite a lot of genuine good effort of trying to be as diverse as possible on the obvious visible diversity things. So, for example, there is a BAME group, much as I'm sceptical about that, as I said, and there is a real attempt to encourage people, non-white people, to apply for things, to go for things, and things like that. Women, I mean, from when I joined in my current role in 2014, over the last 7 years, all the top jobs were male, every single one of them. Whereas now we have a female ambassador in Washington, which is one of the top 3 or 4 jobs. We're having a female ambassador in New York to the United Nations, which is the top job. We still have a white male in charge of the whole organisation, but for the first time in about 12 years, he's not called Simon. So I guess that's something. But I think other kinds of diversity which are less obvious, we're making less success with, I would say. So, for example, disability is something where it feels a little bit like there's a lot of nice things being said, but there is still a bias there. And I think the sort of more invisible things, as you were saying, Brian, about neurodiversity, I think those are much less tackled, because any organisation has a culture and has sort of a certain assumptions around these are the way things should be done, these are the way we should think, these are the assumptions we should make. And if you take a different approach, some of that is naive, it's clumsy, it's not right for that organisation, and you need to kind of get a bit cleverer and a bit sharper with the way you. But some of it is a kind of a neurodiversity issue, and unpicking all of that and understanding that, I think we're a million miles from, to be honest. I really do think that's an area we need to get better at, and I think we'll make a lot of missteps before we make a lot of right steps in that field. I think the learning and development field is slightly different. That the first part of what I'm saying there is around government, which actually is doing quite a lot of good stuff. Learning and development is all about credibility. You cannot get into a position where you're attempting to influence or teach or train or whatever other people unless you are credible. You come across as a credible person. So it's all around that. So I think there is an enormous amount of diversity in learning and development. In terms of things like gender and sexual orientation and those kind of race, etc. But in terms of, unless you're a really convincing communicator, there are barriers. There are huge barriers. So I don't know, for example, if people have speech impediments or if people have disabilities which impair their communication, if people are blind or something like that. I suspect there's an enormous number of problems getting into the learning and development industry, and there isn't a lot of thought about what we can do about that. So I think that there's a lot of good stuff on those fairly visible areas, and I think a huge amount of advances has been made in those areas, but there's quite a few areas where I think we're all lacking, and I don't have the answers. I just know I notice some of the problems, and I'm sure there's a million problems I don't notice.
Right, thanks, John. As always, the chat is still open for any questions if anyone wants to type those in. In the meantime, I might just ask our 3 excellent speakers if they have questions for each other, if there was anything that came up. They might have, or also Meg might have a question or something to say. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
The phrase of 2020. So yeah, just to say thank you all very much. I think it was really, really useful discussion, not only of steps, possible opportunities for our students going forward, but also, I particularly like the ideas around how a presentation. I think my sister, is an HR executive. I always say she's a captain of industry. She's like, this very, very important person in a big company, and she's second in command of this big company. And she would always say, you have to dress for the job you want, not the job you have, right? And it was all like, so her, those kind of like career tips she would give you, like when I was, younger. But that idea of presenting yourself as sort of already there, you're already at that destination. And I think everybody here was saying that in a different way, whether in terms of how you present your CV or how you present yourself on social media, and how you discuss the skills that you have, not only saying, yes, I have a BA in English or a BA in publishing or creative writing or whatever it might be, but to identify the skills that are a part of that. I am, and perhaps beyond that, I am an excellent communicator kind of thing. But to be able to identify, that you can critically analyze text, that you can write succinctly and clearly, that you can write to a brief and within a period, to a deadline. You can adjust text to meet the needs of different audiences. That you've had some training in public speaking. I mean, all those different kinds of things, or dressing for the job you want, in that kind of terminology. There's some questions coming up now and comments in the chat. Rebecca says, this has been an incredible discussion. I've written reams of notes. Thank you so much to everyone giving us so much food for thought. Sarah Buddha is saying, jack of all trades, in other words. Well, I think I don't know that a professional writer would be a jack of all trades, but I would hope that a professional writer could get a job in many, many, many different kinds of trades, as I have had too. Like you guys, I've had a squiggly career, and I've worked in the film industry. I worked at an auction house. I worked for an advertising agency, and I did lots of different other things while I was, and also I was a really terrible secretary because I don't like to do things for other people. So I gave that a miss, but all the other things, really in every job I ever had, what happened was that I was soon identified as somebody who knew how to write, and then that took me on to something else. So that's why I feel so passionately about this subject. Prasadena says, I wanted to thank you all. John, you raised a great point. I find that invisible disabilities such as mental health issues are often overlooked. Absolutely. And that should become part of our, our conversations around diversity and inclusion. Absolutely.
Yeah, if I could just come in quickly on that point about jack of all trades. I don't think that's what it is. It's more like a kind of a skeleton key than anything else. That if you are a great communicator, if you are a good writer, it opens an enormous number of doors. And I think that's a big distinction from being the sort of jack of all trades principle.
Yeah. No, I agree, John. I think one of the things I think we were both trying to say was that you're actually making overt what is buried in your degree description in a way that allows people to understand, particularly say you've done a joint honours in English and creative writing, to unpack some of that. In terms of mental health, I think again, it's an optimism-pessimism thing here. Remote learning does give some opportunities for people who find it difficult to deal with office environments, with regular commutes, with regular hours, but who have got a huge amount to contribute to an organisation, to contribute to that organisation flexibly. And I think we will see that, particularly in the neurodiverse field, where I've seen it already occurring in the cybersecurity industry, an acceptance that people working at their own time, in their own way, in their own space, can contribute a lot. The challenge, as I said before, and I'm not sure how we answer this, and I'd love to know what the other panelists think, is how in that incredibly competitive gig economy where it's all about presenting and communicating and hassling, if you're challenged in those areas, how you can get through to people to understand that your very flexibility is what you need, it's what they need. So they can't see you as a conventional person working in a conventional way, but they need to be able to see you as one of the flexible workers in the gig economy who can contribute flexibly to their organization. And the ability of people to project themselves may present exactly the same sorts of challenges, and they may face exactly the same sorts of barriers as they have in the traditional economy. So it may not make a difference. I don't know. I don't know what you two think about that.
Do you want to? Were you speaking, Aisha?
Sorry.
I wasn't sure.
No, well, either of you. I mean, how do you think?
I wasn't sure if Aisha was speaking and on mute. Sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry, could you say the question again, Brian?
Does this new economy, presuming we're going to see a very different way of working, is that an opportunity for neurodiverse people, for people with mental health problems, because of the flexible working model, because of working from home? Or is it because it's going to be accompanied by much greater gig economy, presenting a whole set of new challenges because they have to fight for those gigs in the same way as they have to fight for traditional jobs and so on? I tend to think there's a bit of an opportunity here if we can put in place the kind of training and support for people, because the structures of having to go into the office, of having to deal with that conventional way of working has hopefully broken down in many organizations. And that could be an opening for people to understand that people have got a whole range of skills that they can bring to an organization, and turning up every day at 9 o'clock on Monday to sit in an office with 10 other people isn't necessarily the most important one.
Yeah, I think, increasingly with the sort of gig economy is going towards specializations which allow people to fit the jobs around their personal needs and personal lifestyles or personal wishes. I'm not an expert in mental health, so I don't really want to say too much more, but what I've seen in the learning and development sector, which is often, many different providers that are either self-employed or in very small businesses, and they do structure their kind of their gigs, their work around their personal needs, whatever they may be, whether or not they're mental health or whether or not they're just preferences that they have chosen. But in terms of the sort of hustle of how to get the business, a lot of that, of course, is about building relationships and building your credibility over time. But it's essentially about building relationships, and therefore, if you are in a position where that's a more difficult thing for you, you will be in a more difficult position if part of your job is to get your own business. Where I've seen that work successfully is where there's a good relationship builder with a good deliverer, and they work together, where they each play to their strengths. So perhaps that's more the model that people will go to.
Yeah, that's interesting.
A hustler and a deliverer. I don't know what the right phrase is, but yeah. Like the A-team. Everyone's got a speciality, but together they form a perfect, beautiful whole.
Can I just add to that again? Sort of like John, not an expert on mental health, and so I won't comment on that. But certainly in terms of echoing Brian, though, opportunities are there. Yes, I think that's probably the good thing to come out of this pandemic. Also, in terms of sort of it's. As you said, it's perhaps not the most effective and productive thing just to go turn up at work at 9 o'clock and then clock off at 5 o'clock, and sort of, we are able to be far more productive, at home and working around various different multitasking and juggling different things. But I do think in terms of how to get there and getting those gigs in, the first instance, and if you have additional challenges, that's hard. I say that from somebody who's who's built up a portfolio now and is being able to do some of the projects and consultancy work, etc. But that has come after many years of getting that network, building that network, and refreshing it. And that comes a lot with face-to-face contact and people that I've met along the way. So, you know, opportunities, yes, but I think it's, again, you will need support. And how do you do that and give people, particularly with invisible disabilities in that sense, that support? That's the biggest, I think that's worth looking into. But yeah, I'm an optimist, so I say opportunity.
So as you say, I think it's probably another whole session and discussion. And as Sarah says in the discussion there, be optimistic and don't close the eyes to an opportunity that may not look like it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think if it's potentially going in the right direction, it's always difficult, isn't it? Because it becomes that kind of balance between you need to pay the bills, but is this really what you want to do, or is this even ethically questionable? But you've got bills to pay. There's always those issues, and you have to be pragmatic and realistic.
Well, thank you all so much. I think we'll end it on that optimistic and pragmatic note. Really very, very, very grateful to you all. Please do, everyone, put your, if you haven't already in the last session, do put your phone number in the chat if you would like to become part of our WhatsApp group, and we will be sending further information about careers and information, that kind of thing. And thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Peter, for chairing, and thank you, Brian and John and Aisha for joining. It's been lovely to see you. I miss you guys.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Nice to see you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks
Good
again.
job, Peter.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.